So we're sitting here on February 25th as Putin and Russian forces are rolling into Kyiv, and we know it's a challenging time. But as we take a look at what's happened in recent months, I think one thing that's very impressive, and that's the remarkable sense of unity that has been built up by coalition partners, by allies, but also those who haven't always been allies in opposing Putin's actions. What are your views on the efforts to date in building and maintaining a coalition in opposition to the Russian invasion? General Petraeus?
I think it's been very impressive. And, I've criticized the current administration about the decision in Afghanistan and the execution of it. I think it's only fair to offer some praise for the way that they have consulted just around the clock, have built, again, unity. I'm just back from the Munich Security Conference several days ago. I've gone there for years. I've never seen the kind of unity that was expressed there since the end of the Cold War. I saw it when I was a speechwriter for the Supreme Allied Commander Europe as a young major, went there for the first time. It was all about the alliance and so forth. In the wake of the Cold War, NATO was a little bit adrift. It was seeking a new, what is the reason to live? Out of area threats was a consideration and so forth. Well, in this case, while Vladimir Putin is out to make Russia great again, and that's a work in progress at best, and we are doing all that we can to thwart that, he has clearly made NATO great again. It is a central organization to this particular effort. Again, there is enormous unity. Yes, it may take a bit sometimes to get complete unity on something as dramatic as cutting off Russian access to the SWIFT financial transaction system. But it was very impressive, again, to see leader after leader at that Munich Security Conference express absolute solidarity in opposition to Russia and what Russia at that time might do. And now to see it continue as Russia has actually carried out this brutal, horrible invasion of their neighbor, and of really, in many respects, a fellow Russian country in some respects, but which their actions in recent years, since 2014, have actually increased the sense of Ukrainian identity as separate and distinct from that of Russia. So this has been seriously impressive. And if you saw on day one, when Putin's forces went into Ukraine, the very first leader to announce the very first sanction was the Chancellor of Germany, in the job only for really still weeks after the 15, 16 years of Chancellor Merkel. And he announces the biggest sanction that anyone could have hoped for from Germany, which was to put the certification of Nord Stream 2, the natural gas pipeline direct from Russia into Germany, on hold. There are consequences for Germany in this regard as well, in terms of the price of natural gas in the final months of winter. So what has gone on here, I think, has been very, very impressive. And it has actually extended beyond NATO as well. It's our other partners in the Indo-Pacific region that have all stood up and said that borders are inviolable. This kind of aggression cannot be permitted. It's a complete and utter violation of all the principles that have really guided the world since the establishment of the UN Charter in the wake of World War II. And certainly it's the biggest event for Europe since the end of the Cold War. So great to see everyone come together in the way that we have. In the UK, by the way, of course, now no longer part of the EU, has actually walked point for several of these initiatives. They were the first C-17s to land in Ukraine. Normally the UK is drafting off the US, to use a bicycle analogy. In this case, the US drafted off the UK, certainly came in with 10 times the C-17s, as we should, but it was the UK that started it. So again, this is very impressive. And I think the administration does deserve a degree of praise and compliments for what it has done tirelessly, indefatigably, and very impressively.
Sir John, the view from the UK and Europe.
Well, I agree with all of that, and the quality of the decision making and the thinking lying behind it which of course includes the quite unusual and day by day, hour by hour use of intelligence, of course, situation and the intelligence, if you like, available from it. I mean, we can call it intelligence, but the data management from it, in a way, in many respects, made that easier, and it was easier to protect sources and so on because of the nature of the situation. We have to acknowledge that, but still. Of course, it's absolutely critical that, if you like, unhappily, it was proven to be right. And so all the doubts that were being expressed right up until the last minute, particularly across Europe, as to what was going to happen and what Russian intentions were, and they were removed by not just by what the Russians did yesterday, but also what Putin said. And not just Putin, by the way. I mean, as you know, Mark, I was in Russia for 3 days or 2 days last week, and in Moscow, and of course, I heard much of the same thing building up. And in fact, I came away feeling quite clear in my mind that this was something like this was going to happen. I'd found it hard beforehand to get my head around it, frankly, that it was really, definitely going to happen. But having listened for a couple of days, I wasn't surprised. However, I don't want to be gloomy, but all the same, just being cautious, in a way, preserving unity in these circumstances, in the face of the intelligence which is there, which wasn't completely accepted by everybody within the alliance, has been relatively straightforward in the run-up to the present situation. But the big test is going to come in the period ahead. If we assume that, however difficult the Russians might find it, establishing control in Ukraine, that is clearly what they're determined to do. And there's a chance, quite a high chance, that they will be effective in establishing control, including over the government and so on. I mean, this is something, in a way that they know how to do. We'll have to see. But what does NATO do then? What do the allies do then? How do you face, and answer the questions? Well, do we maintain some kind of contact with Vladimir Putin, or do we just, expel him from everything and refuse to do business? Well, we may say that, to start with. And I'm just seeing coming up on the news items that the Council of Europe has expelled Russia, or at least removed Russia. Even worse, they've been expelled from the Eurovision Song Contest, which is very serious. And of course, football tournaments and everything. I mean, that is underway at the moment. And of course, it's being accelerated in a way by what the language that Putin is using. Well, I've sort of dealt with him or around him and so on for years and years, but I'm a bit surprised at some of the things I'm hearing now. And they'll talk about denazification and genocide and so on. It's extraordinary. Of course, that's having a negative impact globally, not just in Europe, and it makes unification easier. But still, it's almost guaranteed that there's going to be an argument about how we deal with Putin in the future if he, as it were, in the short term, wins out in terms of controlling Ukraine, and is a big player and is the big player in Russia still. And the arguments for maintaining contact and having a negotiating and moderating capability and all those things are going to be there. So we're going to have to think about that, and that's going to be quite subtle. And we must also remember that listening to the speeches from Ukrainian government figures now, including Zelensky, and indeed he was like this at Munich, he's saying, okay, thank you all very much for your big support and your big words, but that's not enough. At the end of the day, Ukraine is, as it were, protecting Europe on its own. Everybody, from the president and the prime minister downwards, is saying, well, we're not, and indeed our defense secretary, former Scots Guards officer, we're not actually going to, of course, put troops into Ukraine, and we're not going to end up fighting any Russians because it's just far too risky. But of course, it's quite easy to agree with that, but we've got to think through the consequences of saying that, and for it to be so clear that when it came to it, NATO was not able to stop the invasion of, okay, not a NATO member, but a partner country and a close partner country. And so I'm expecting the test for NATO, if you like, and the test for unified decision making and indeed leadership. I expect those to be more tight and more severe and serious in the period likely to be ahead, even than they've been so far.
So obviously, we're seeing a succession of packages of sanctions coming out from the US, from the UK, and from many others. And yet we're also seeing that Vladimir Putin had months to prepare. And so he squirreled away resources. He has, as much as he can, taken steps to protect data, to protect his systems. So for all of the talk that we have about sanctions and shock and awe sanctions, are we doomed to fail given that Putin had so much time to prepare? Sir John, I'll begin with you.
Well, the sanctions on their own, certainly now, are not going to, well, they haven't stopped him carrying on with the invasion and in effect a full-scale invasion. And it was very clear with what I was hearing last week that they were sort of being semi-discounted, in discussions and policy-making discussions in Moscow, because what we're dealing with here is, from a Russian point of view, a very deep, or at least from a Putin point of view, a very deep and fundamental issue. The future of Ukraine and the future relationship of Ukraine and indeed the territories around it with Russia. Just listening to his speeches in the last few days and reading his article from last July and all that, you can see the thinking and the emotions which are involved here. And so sanctions are probably a detail, however serious you might think they are, and they take quite a long time to have an effect. And the idea that somehow or another business oligarch friends of the president are going to turn up in the Kremlin and say, well, I'm sorry, it's going to affect our apartment in Kensington and you mustn't do it. I mean, that we're well past that stage. Well past that stage.
General Petraeus, since Putin has had so much time to prepare, are sanctions doomed to fail?
No, they were doomed to fail to prevent him from attacking, clearly. Yeah. But these sanctions can have an enormous effect over time. The problem is, of course, that as was noted, he has prepared. Russia has over $600 billion in foreign reserves stored up. It has a very small debt to GDP ratio, many, many multiples less than ours, for example. Yeah. And again, he has been working to try to figure out how he could build resilience for the Russian economy and even for himself. A yacht that's believed to be his, for example, slipped out of a European port recently and is presumably headed towards Sochi or somewhere. So again, they can't bring him to his knees in the short term. He'll continue doing what he's doing, and inevitably, there's no question that over time, Russian forces will overwhelm the Ukrainian forces. The question is whether this becomes so painful, whether this becomes Russia's Afghanistan, if you will. And of course, Putin's old enough to remember that humiliating experience. And you have a situation here where the population at large is really very anti-Russian at this point in time, where all males are expected to join the effort to resist. So again, their organized military forces cannot withstand the onslaught of the Russian forces, but they are fighting hard. They're going to make them pay a very high price, and the bleeding won't stop. Again, they may control the outskirts of Kyiv, but to take down a city, to clear a city of those who are fighting against you, of 3 million people, that is serious work. And in the end, it will result in enormous damage to Kyiv, because there will be a point at which the military commanders will take a sniper shot from a building. They'll just destroy that building. So you'll see a bit of what went on in Grozny, I suspect. But the idea would be to make it so painful, to make it a porcupine, as the Ukrainians said to me, the parliamentary delegation at the Munich Security Conference said, we will be a porcupine that the bear cannot digest, cannot swallow. And then perhaps there's some opportunity for some kind of negotiated settlement with, Ukraine declaring that it will be neutral and so forth. But this is going to be really hard for the Russians long term. It's not, again, these tactical battles and successes that they will inevitably at some point enjoy. Again, they have vastly more resources. Over time, though, this is going to be very, very difficult for them to continue to control. It's not even clear to me that they'll be able to go all the way to the west. They'll do damage to Lviv. They're already shelling it or hitting it with bombs and missiles and so forth. They can do a great deal of damage, but whether they can control these major metropolitan areas, I think is very much in question.
Yes, I am.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, well, I very much agree with that. The key point to watch, I mean, we're talking about sanctions and so on, and Western governments are talking about sanctions, but the key point to watch is what is actually happening on the ground and the degree and effectiveness or otherwise of resistance. And of course, in particular, of course, the damage and the casualties and so on, which are suffered. And it's very important to remember that part of the risk that has been taken by Moscow here is that there's going to, I mean, you see very little sign of public enthusiasm in Moscow or in Russia for this campaign.
Well, there's opposition. There are demonstrations on the street, even though the Russian authorities have said, if you demonstrate, we will detain you. It's going to be rough and you will have a criminal record as a result of this. And you still see fairly sizable demonstrations in major Russian cities.
No, I agree. And one didn't get any sense, I must say, just from being there and sort of obviously just at a very limited number of government policy-making meetings and so on last week of sort of growing enthusiasm or support at all. So the risk, and of course also the sense that, I mean, quite a few people who said war between Russia and Ukraine is unthinkable. And that word unthinkable was used quite a lot. And of course, because you've got an uncle in Kiev or a cousin in Lvov or whatever. And I'm afraid I'm using the Russian expressions for the names for the towns there. It's my Soviet background, which is giving me away. I can't get my head around these Ukrainian city names. And there are personal connections, family connections. And, KGB was full of Ukrainian officers and commanders and so on. It's very complicated. This, of course, goes into the Putin point about we're all one country, but that we're all one country cuts both ways. And if the damage is big enough and it goes on for long enough, then that is what is going to count.
Gentlemen, you've been generous with your time. One last question. This is already being referred to as the TikTok war, because of the use of technologies in which everyday citizens are able to get messages out and images out, and it's sort of working both ways, right? It is shown when Russian forces have been moving on places. On the other hand, it has also shown the courage of everyday Ukrainians. Is this what we're going to see going forward? Handheld technology, the battle of handheld technology shaping how the world looks at conflicts? Sir John, I'll start with you.
Well, yes. Well, inevitably, it's going to be it's going to be there, particularly if it's like this to us, so close in Europe. And you can see that for all their famous and their famed control of disinformation and so on, that the Russian authorities are on the defensive about this, and they don't quite know how to handle it. And it's not surprising that they don't. So it's a big issue and problem for them. Yes.
General Petraeus.
Everyone is a reporter with a cell phone in hand and can contribute to the public debate and so forth. TikTok, Twitter, a few of these other social media applications enable that. And I'd almost say it's the aggregators war, because it's those that can aggregate all of these, and data mining, if you will, that have the algorithms to bring it all together and then to present it to their customers, their clients, and to show in a way what is taking place on the ground, literally real time. And that's quite extraordinary. If you think they can literally beat the chain of command, which is reporting, it's even flatter now than back in my day, all the way to the Pentagon. So if you really want to know what's going on, it used to be turn on CNN. Now it would be to have one of these feeds alongside CNN and alongside your own command and control network. So this is very significant. And, we've long known this in the intelligence community. The CIA, in fact, runs for the Director of National Intelligence, the Open Source Center. The CIA has a very substantial number of people who are committed to doing nothing but mining social media, the internet, all of these different sources of information, and then fusing it with traditional sources of information from human, digital, imagery, cyber signals, and so forth, actual intelligence, and then to present a finished product to someone in the national security policy making realm. The really interesting initiative here is something, again, that Sir John mentioned earlier, which is the United States taking this finished product, ensuring that it will not expose sources and methods, laundering it a bit perhaps, and then putting it out as public information, but doing it very, very rapidly and presenting ground truth. We sought to do this in Iraq during the surge when I was privileged to be the commander. Our admonition for the dealing with the press aspect of our job was to be first with the truth. So beat the bad guys to the headlines, but with the truth as you know it at that time. Don't put lipstick on pigs, don't spin, don't just get it out there and try to, again, to beat the extremists, the Iranian supported militia, the insurgents, to get that headline. So at best they get the subtitle, not the top. And in this case, the Biden administration is doing that very impressively. And I think it has also shown how good the intelligence has been, because they have, sadly, predicted precisely what has happened, what has unfolded.
Great. Thanks to both of you. I really do appreciate the extra time. Sadly, these conversations will need to be continued, I suspect, for weeks and months to come. Dave Petraeus, John Scarlett, thank you very, very much. Much appreciated.
Privilege.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks.